Eina mana, eina reo, Rorangatira ma, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Tracy Epps. I'm a trade law and policy consultant here in Wellington. And on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the New Zealand branch of the Institute of International Affairs, I would like to welcome you to this virtual public session of the 2022 Beeby Exchange on International Law. Now, I was previously a lawyer with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I'm delighted that this year they've asked me to help in coordinating the Beeby Exchange. As many of you know, the annual Beeby Exchange is an opportunity for the international law community in New Zealand to come together to discuss issues of current interest. It's a unique event in that it brings together lawyers from academia, from government, and from private practice, groups that have many mutual interests, but who don't always get an opportunity to engage with each other enough in their day-to-day work. In coming together like this, we honour Chris Beeby, a New Zealand diplomat and jurist with a lifelong interest in the development and implementation of international law. Now, usually, of course, the Beeby Exchange would have been held in person, and it would have been held last November. We made the decision to postpone it this year due to COVID, and we certainly hope that we can all get together again this November. But in the meantime, it seems fitting that we can come together online to discuss a topic that is born out of the very reason that we can't be together in person: the prospects for an international pandemic treaty. Now, obviously, at the moment, it's an incredibly difficult time for the world and for international law, and international law is facing enormous challenges. But as overwhelming as everything seems to be right now, the topic of a pandemic treaty certainly remains as important as ever. And we are really delighted and honoured to be joined today by the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who last year was the co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, set up by the World Health Organization to review the global handling of the pandemic. Thank you so much, Helen, for giving up some of your valuable time today to join us. We wish it was in person, but we're absolutely thrilled to have you with us. We're also delighted to be joined by Professor Alexander Gillespie from the Faculty of Law at the University of Waikato, and Victoria Hallam, Chief International Legal Advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And Victoria is very well placed to speak to us tonight, as she is head of the New Zealand delegation participating in the negotiations for the treaty. So just very briefly, as many of you will know, in December, the members of the World Health Organization agreed to kickstart the process to draft and negotiate an international agreement to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. So I'm going to ask our three panelists a series of questions about this topic, and we will have time for questions afterwards from the audience. And I would ask you to please put those questions forward via the Q&A function. You can enter those at any time, and we'll make sure we keep plenty of time, hopefully at least half an hour, 20 minutes for those questions. I'd now like to turn to Helen and ask you, Helen, if you could please get us started by talking to us about the background to the proposed new treaty and the work you've been involved in.
Well, thanks, Tracy, and thanks to MFAP for the invitation to be part of this. What I would say as a preface is that when the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response recommended the negotiation of a Pandemic Framework Convention under Article 19 of the WHO Constitution, it was as part of a package of reforms. What we didn't necessarily envisage would be that there might be attempts to try to put the whole package of reforms into the treaty. And I think there is a bit of conflation like that at the moment, which worries me, because I think if there's too broad a scope for it, this could make negotiation quite difficult. Not least in the current highly charged geopolitical context. So I think that the more we can keep a focus on what really needs to be done and keep it as technical as possible, the more likely we are to make progress at the moment. Even that will be difficult for reasons we can discuss later on. What our panel did call for was through the UN General Assembly negotiating an overarching political declaration around the whole reform package. And different bodies, organisations would have responsibility for taking forward elements of the package, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be a coherent package, and we did envisage it being under the oversight going forward of a Global Health Threats Council. So that's just by way of introduction. Now, on the need for new legal provisions, the pandemic and the way it's been handled have, without doubt to our panel, demonstrated the limits of the current international legal framework governing pandemic threats. The main existing instrument is the International Health Regulations of 2005. People say it's good in principle, but it's limited in scope. It focuses on managing the spread of pathogens and seems overly concerned really with balancing public health measures with the imperatives of trade and travel. Written in 2005, they seem to me to be regulations out of time. I also always have ringing in my ears the advice of Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was Director General of WHO at the time of SARS. She is very clear in private and in public that in her opinion, she could not have managed SARS as effectively as she did if she had had to operate under these regulations, which were supposed to be an improvement. So I think that's a bit of a wake-up call to me. So every time the IHR have been applied, not just to this disease outbreak, there have been cracks showing. And there's always that tension over the speed at which a country notifies a threat and the travel and trade restrictions that tend to flow after that. Countries need to see disease notification as part of their national interest and not just as an immediate threat to their economies, which maybe they should hide for a while until it becomes untenable. The IHR, and particularly the public health emergency of international concern declaration weapon, have been applied in different ways and over very different situations over the years. For example, with the H1N1 flu pandemic in 2009, there were accusations that the FIIC, which I'm going to call it for short, ghastly acronym, was called too readily for a pathogen that turned out not to be very dangerous. Conversely, for Ebola in West Africa, within the last decade, there was a huge reluctance to use the tool and declare a public health emergency of international concern. That reluctance came from the affected countries and it came from WHO. And in the view of many, led the disease to spread far further in the affected countries than it would have had it been nipped in the bud at an early stage when it first appeared in Forest, Guinea. That was certainly my view sitting in New York at the time and seeing too little effective engagement from WHO headquarters. Meanwhile, just a few months before Ebola became a major issue, a FIIC had been declared for polio, and this was seen as much more political than a required public health measure. So, there's a kind of rocky history around all this. But then you come to the emergence of COVID-19, where the cracks in the system were on full display. So to name a few, our independent panel compiled an authoritative chronology which set out the delays at every point of the emergence of this pathogen. Delays in reporting, delays in reacting, due in part to a lack of precision around timing, an inability of WHO to visit the site immediately, the pure bureaucracy of following the IHR's communication rules. We understand it can't publish information without the consent of the country providing it. There wasn't enough clarity on what information and what genetic material needed to be shared when and with whom. And it was many days before WHO was able to report meaningfully on a new respiratory pathogen. As well, in the view of our panel, waiting for cast iron evidence of human-to-human transmission of a respiratory pathogen is to wait far too long. We feel that a precautionary approach is warranted, but the IHR are not currently conducive to that. We were very critical of the lack of transparency around the emergency committee and the way it operates under the regulations. It was incomprehensible to our panel that no decision to support the FIIC declaration was made when the committee first convened around 23 January 2020. A week was lost, in the course of which the WHO DG went to China, no doubt to put the case for why they should support the FIIC being declared. On his return, the committee was reconvened and the FEAC was supported, but another precious week was lost while virus transmission picked up speed. So, in summary, the IHR have no real disincentives for non-compliance. There is insufficient monitoring of and support for core capacities. It doesn't have a One Health focus, which is a major issue. There are overall gaps in the legal framework in a range of areas. And in my opinion, quite a lot of the issues could be dealt with through the IHR, but there may well be issues which could be usefully in a framework convention, and that is something to be negotiated and picked over. But I would not myself be trying to put a major oversight governance mechanism, a financing mechanism, a redesigned action on COVID tools accelerator and COVAX, et cetera, into a convention. I think it's probably heavier than the negotiating traffic can wear in the current context. The independent panel, as I said, did support the negotiation of a framework convention, but didn't envisage the whole package of our reforms going into it. We thought the convention could best perhaps elaborate the norms and ethics around pandemic preparedness, response management, and the respective responsibilities of member states and WHO. All along, this complication has been that the IHR review committee that was constituted didn't recommend any changes to the IHR in the light of the COVID experience. It said the IHR weren't the problem. The question was one of implementation. We don't agree with that at the panel. We think a lot could be done through IHR changes, and I'm delighted to see the US picking up a range of our suggestions for change in its recent proposals. So let me finish those opening comments there, Tracy.
Thank you very much for those comments. So I'd like to turn now, I guess, to just talk a little bit more about what the existing rules are. Helen, you've said that there are a lot of gaps in the IHR, the International Health Regulations, and a lot of changes that need to be made. Victoria, could you perhaps talk us through some of the current legal situation, how the IHR do work for our audience?
Yes, absolutely. Kia ora koutou. Before doing that, though, Tracy, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of the points that Helen has made around, why a new treaty. I mean, my point of view as an international lawyer is that much good international law is forged in times of crisis. So you have to use these opportunities when there is a will to try and improve the system. And I think that's the perspective from which we are coming at this. I mean, clearly a virus doesn't comply with international law itself. So how could a treaty help? Some people might be asking. For me, there are two threshold questions whenever you're thinking about whether a treaty is the answer to a problem, especially when you're talking about large multilateral treaties. So the two questions I ask myself is this a problem that states alone cannot solve themselves? Does it have a transboundary element, or is it about the global commons in some way? And I think we all learned through horrible experience that a pandemic is absolutely one of those problems. Even though we have the good fortune to be in a country that had a very good and very effective response, it still isn't an answer to the whole problem. So yes, I think the pandemic is a problem that would benefit from rules. And then I guess the second threshold question for me is there some additional advantage in having systems and tools and rules that are actually binding, because that's the additional value a treaty brings. Although arguably you could also say a treaty is somehow seen as more important. It's got more profile. And I think there are some advantages in having binding rules and something that's really well understood. But to pivot now to your specific question, there are already a lot of rules in this area, and Helen's pointed to the IHRs as a really significant building block is how I would look at them. The IHRs are established under the World Health Organization constitution. They are adopted through the World Health Assembly mechanisms, and the IHRs that we have in this context, they're a chunky piece of. I'm just looking for my copy here. They're a chunky piece of law. They were developed in 2005. Clearly a bit outdated, but we already have a treaty of a sort. It's just not a treaty that covers everything to the extent we would want. Some of the provisions are flawed. And it was also the international law treaty that I think none of us as international lawyers had actually ever heard of. I mean, we became very suddenly aware of these things called the IHRs in about March, April 2020, when we were suddenly having to provide advice on them. So there is an issue around profile. And the other thing I wanted to say about existing law is that the World Health Organization Constitution contains some really important principles, and then general international law applies to health situations, just as it does to other situations. So there are rules that will be familiar to those international lawyers on the webinar, things like state responsibility, the general obligation not to cause transboundary harm, human rights law, trade law, and international intellectual property law. That is all still applies to this context. So I think we have a really good base to build on. And what I'm really interested in, and I think it does link to some of the points Helen made, how do we build on that in a useful and meaningful way that improves the overall system, but I guess also doesn't overdo it. I'm absolutely in agreement. You don't necessarily need to shove everything in a treaty. Some things are just fine where they are. So I hope it goes some way to answering your question, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder if I could turn now to Elle, and she's sort of going back to where you started, Victoria, which is a question of how can a new treaty actually assist in this situation, where we have a virus that itself is not hardly going to abide by international law. So Victoria, you've talked about, some of what you think the benefits would be. Elle, could you give us your thoughts?
Kia ora. I don't think you're ever going to reduce the risk to zero of the next pathogen, but I think it's highly foreseeable that more are on the way, that they're going to be different. The challenges in a globalized world are going to be more intense than what they were in the past. We've been in this area of international law since 1851. There's been 6 iterations of the rules right through to the current ones, which are, as everyone's saying, in 2005. And I'll be honest, they're pretty good. They're really not bad. But the problem is they weren't good enough, and we need to do better. Now, to answer your question, can we stop the next pathogen? The answer is no, but we can slow it down. We can get more time, we can reduce the risk. And right now, keeping that time of exposure as short as possible, so countries have got time to prepare, is our best possible defence.
Great, thank you, Al. Helen, perhaps I can just turn back to you to see if you would like to respond to some of the points made by Victoria and Al in terms of how a new treaty itself could help. I guess at this point, regardless of whether we're looking at putting new rules into the IHR or a standalone treaty.
Well, Al just made a critical point. We don't know when the next pathogen with pandemic potential is going to appear. In many ways, we've dodged a bullet for over a century before this one struck. And I don't mean in saying that by any means to diminish the significance of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which took many lives globally, nor the lives from Ebola or various other pathogens which have been serious. But we have seen nothing like this since 1918. But the rate of spillover of animal to human diseases, the zoonotic diseases, is increasing. It could be tomorrow, it could be next week, it could be 10 years, who knows? But do we want to go into it with as ineffective a toolbox and set of institutional arrangements and lack of dedicated financing as we have at the moment? Those are the key issues. I agree with Al that on timing, you just have to have the tools to respond to these fast. I mean, our panel was clear. WHO should have been on the site immediately. It couldn't be. It didn't have that access, didn't have that right of access. It needed to be able to publish very quickly everything it knew. Didn't have permission. It needed to act in a precautionary fashion. The way you have to dot I's and cross T's in the procedures of the IHR didn't make that possible. The Director General should be able to make a call. For heaven's sake, this is the head of the world's global health organization elected by member states. An emergency committee becomes an encumbrance if it's convened, if you like, with the understanding that nothing will happen unless they recommend it, because that's where politics gets in the way of making the right global health decisions. We lost a month because of those kinds of failings. So these things can be addressed. I think a lot of them can be addressed in the IHR, but they must be addressed. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same fix again. And I'll make one last point. You know, when there's a proper process that leads to a declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, member states need to take it seriously. There's not much evidence that many did. I think many had their hands folded saying, oh, well, you know, maybe it'll be like SARS, it won't come here. And it wasn't until the devastating pennies dropped with what happened in Italy, I suspect, that the Western world started to wake up rather too late. In the course of doing one of a zillion webinars and seminars on this subject, I went back and researched when the first case appeared in New Zealand. And the Ministry of Health here issued a statement on the 28th of February 2020 saying the first case of COVID-19 had been detected in New Zealand and widespread community transmission was not likely. Well, yeah, the rest is history, isn't it? So we don't take seriously enough international declarations that are made pursuant to a proper legal process. When IHR committee said perhaps implementation was the problem, well, there is a point that if you ignore what these processes lead to, you will also create enormous problems.
Al, Victoria, would you like to respond to any of the points Helen's just made before we move on?
Victoria?
I guess thinking about negotiating a treaty, there's obviously different ways we can go about it. Again, whether it's a treaty, whether it's working based on the rules that we have. I'd like to talk about what New Zealand's approach should be. I think that'll be of a lot of interest to the members of the audience. So perhaps if I could start, maybe here we'll start with Al and then turn to Helen before we go to the source itself with Victoria.
Thank you. I am of the view that New Zealand has two unique advantages in these negotiations. The first one is our excellent COVID record. So I think we can speak with some credibility, but also as an honest broker, but that we can actually straddle between countries and reach between different groups. So I think we should be taking the high ground and often put forward some of the more difficult proposals in the hope of finding a middle path between them.
I mean, from your perspective, Al, what are the more difficult proposals that you might suggest we would put forward?
Well, Helen's alluded to this earlier. I mean, like if you actually even look at the beginning of the scope of the treaty over what's going to be in it, I don't even think we could agree right now what the title of it would actually be. And whether you look at early notification, whether you look at compliance, whether you look at funding or equity, I think for me, if it was my proposal, I would look at the issue of early notification and preparedness and focus just on that initial question. All of the others are very legitimate, but I wouldn't deal with them here. The other aspect I would look at, which would be controversial, is trying to have a predictive element to when we actually able to work out we don't just respond to disease, we try to work out through the existing organizations and existing science where it's possible or likely the next one will be. I would also consider new standards around where the hotspots are. We see these with discussions now around wet markets. I would also add in laboratories. And so I would put forward some of the more provocative areas that some countries will want to steer away from.
Helen, can I ask you to weigh in on this? Be interested to hear your thoughts as well on Al's particular proposals there.
Well,
but on New Zealand's response.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Al that on these issues, as on many, I think New Zealand can have a voice which is bigger than our size and geopolitical importance might imply. We are seen to have had one of the world's most effective responses to COVID. If you look, for example, across the OECD, we have a death rate exponentially lower than that of any other country in the OECD. And whatever happens with Omicron, it frankly isn't going to change that because of the high level of vaccination and ongoing public health measures. So, you know, we can speak with some credibility here. Also, New Zealand is generally seen as an honest broker, wanting to get the best results, not overtly partisan in these kinds of negotiations, but putting forward constructive ideas. So I think if New Zealand is active across the spectrum on how to strengthen the IHR and how to negotiate, you know, a framework convention, that will be useful. But just caution that at the WHA special session in November, all that was agreed on was that an international negotiating board would be set up and would bring proposals back in May 2024. There was no agreement on scope or content or type of instrument. I understand, and Victoria can flesh this out, but the IHR review issues, to the extent they're being considered, have been off with another process in the WHA. So it's not exactly linked up in what's going on in Geneva. And it's got to be clear, I think, that we have to have one track here, that if the IHR are to be improved, then if there's to be a new legal instrument, it needs to be complementary. But I think a major impediment to the form of a new legal instrument is that the US seems no longer able to get any treaty or convention through its Congress. And that, I suspect, is a major reason why there's been dodging around the language and never talking in this WHA decision about what the form would be. So lots of issues to tease out here, but we do have credibility for all the reasons given. I am with Al that I would see an early notification protocol kind of approach, which he, Jim McClay and others have put a lot of great work into, as very, very important. If that was all that came out of a new legal instrument, along with reforms to the IHR, I'd be reasonably happy. I think that's really a big priority.
If I could just ask a quick question, just in response to something you said there, Helen, about you know, the difficulty with the US not being able to get treaties through Congress. In terms of, and Victoria maybe can speak to this as well, but in terms of the process for negotiating, do you need to decide the form, you know, at the outset, or is it possible to talk about the substance and get agreement on some of the substance and then worry about the form, or does the form have to come first?
Well, Victoria's a sort of negotiations and strategy expert, but my feeling would be it probably has to run in parallel, because it might be that you can create enough pressure for a decent convention or treaty that the US would go along with it and agree to it and not obstruct it, but then we have the knowledge that it probably would never ratify it. This is the way things have gone before. It's never ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability, but it didn't obstruct them being negotiated. So that's a possible way forward. And again, you know, Victoria could advise us, but with the Paris Climate Agreement, it was negotiated dancing on the head of a pin, where, you know, technically it's not legally binding. The only thing that's legally binding is that you have to put up your nationally determined you know, plans for implementation, but no target is binding. So these are the kinds of pins that people are going to dance on. But I defer to Victoria's superior legal knowledge and strategy in advising us on this.
Over to you, Victoria.
Thanks very much. Well, the New Zealand position that we're taking into this process is that we support the development of a new legally binding instrument alongside improvement to the existing elements, particularly the IHRs. So from our perspective, this is a colossus with two legs, and the two legs have to walk forward together. So there's that there are two parallel tracks, as Helen said, and that was very evident in the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body last week, because it was preceded with 3 days in the Working Group on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. And that's where the reform of the IHRs, and in particular, the very constructive package of proposals the US has put in, is being talked about. And we tried in good faith to engage in those proposals, but to also say that they can't really be considered separately from the work that's going to go on in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body. And that's important too, when you think that there are a large number of countries that are working together under the banner of Friends of the Pandemic Treaty that are very committed to concluding a treaty. So you have to sort of think, how can we move this discussion along in a way that's constructive so that the different parts of the negotiation all see some chance of getting what they want. And I think the issue, I mean, your question about, do you have to know exactly what the form's going to be in order to work out what the content is? Absolutely not. You shouldn't have to. Form does have a way of really getting in and hindering progress. So I think you have to do a little bit of each and keep moving things forward. So as others have suggested, we are absolutely keen to play our role in being a constructive broker, being brave enough to put forward proposals that we think would make a difference, listening really carefully to where others are coming from, and trying to work out how we can all come out of this with a strengthened World Health Organization, good coordination with other international organizations whose mandate touches upon this, and the majority of the negotiators feeling like they got what they needed, because a negotiation will never work if one significant group isn't getting what their interests are. So one of the strongest areas of focus that we have been working on is the importance that any new instrument has to contribute to a coherent system. We want to avoid fragmentation. It was challenging enough trying to work out how one was meant to comply as a state party to the IHRs. I would hate to think that in future pandemics, people would be looking at a pandemic treaty and the IHRs and whatever else had come out. So we do want that coherence. And also we need something that acknowledges that while this was absolutely a health crisis touches on a whole lot of other things. It touches on human rights, it touches on economies, livelihoods, shipping and aviation, agriculture and wildlife. So we need to improve the ability of the different parts of the international system to interact. And New Zealand's good at that because we all know each other. You know, we can pick up the phone and talk to our colleagues that are interested in the zoonotic risks, and you know, we've worked on issues together. We can join the dots in a way that is harder sometimes for larger countries. So we are absolutely supporting the idea of a new legally binding instrument, but where that eventually gets to, I think there are lots of different options. Minister Little said at the special session last year that the New Zealand view was that the system has many sound elements, such as the IHRs, but the existing rules lack the coherence and status they deserve. We know there are significant gaps to be addressed. So that's what we want to work on. The other thing we've tried to inject into the conversation is what we think some of the key sort of guiding foundational principles should be for any new instrument. And we've come up with 6 that we have introduced into the conversation. And I thought it might be helpful to just run through those. Some of them are obvious, but some of them are not being talked about quite as much. So the first principle is equity. And I think we're in a good place to speak about that, because equity is something that has to happen at the international level, but also you need equity within societies. And one of the good things about the New Zealand response is that we had a strong eye to the protection of everyone in our communities. Second principle that we've introduced is the One Health approach, and Helen's already spoken about that. So the One Health approach is kind of new sort of jargon for me, but it's an approach that focuses on upstream prevention and requires a recognition of the interface between the human health, the animal health aspects, and the environment. And that's really important. The third principle we've introduced into the discussions, which we think could have its place in a new instrument, is something drawn from existing international law. And that is our view that states have an obligation of due diligence in the prevention of harm and an obligation to take due regard for the interests of other states. And we think this is probably an area where that wasn't always met by some states. Now, this is something that Auckland academic Caroline Foster has written a lot about, and she's had a new book come out recently. So I don't know if Caroline's in the audience, but she's got some really good thoughts around due diligence and the prevention of harm and due regard. And then there were three principles which we think kind of work together and balance each other out, but are essential. Transparency is an obvious one. And a lot of what I've heard from both Helen and Alice today is very much on the importance of finding ways to encourage states to be more transparent. And you have to think really creatively about that, because it's often not the natural instinct of any state in a crisis, especially not, especially not some states are more transparent than others, but the instinct to kind of batten down the hatches and kind of hold on, freeze and spot into the place is pretty natural. So transparency is one point of the triangle. Then regulatory coherence, I think, is essential. The measures you adopt have to be measures that could genuinely contribute to the outcome you're seeking. Now, the trade lawyers in the audience will be very familiar with that because it's a core principle of, for example, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement in the WTO. You can't put on border measures that are meant to protect your sort of biodiversity or protect your agriculture unless those measures are actually capable of doing it. And then the third point of that triangle, which I think is also just as essential, is something Helen mentioned, and that's precaution. It has to be legitimate for a country to work out its risk tolerance and set its own level of risk. And I think that makes sense to us because we had a government that took decisions that were very precautious, very quick. They put in measures very early, and that bought us a lot of time and changed the outcome immeasurably for us. But if you think to our broader neighbourhood, what might be appropriate in terms of trade and travel measures for a large continental country with masses of interaction may well not be appropriate to a Pacific Island country with very strong borders as a consequence of natural isolation, but also very vulnerable health systems. So countries have got to be able to set their own risk level, and as long as the measures can realistically contribute to protecting them against the risk, that should be legitimate. Now, I don't think the IHRs have got the balance quite right on that. If you look at the IHR's Article 43, there's quite a tough standard there that you would have to meet to actually justify trade and travel measures. So those were some of the principles we've introduced. Now, they're really just food for thought to try and get people focused on what is the system that we need. So I'll pause there because I'm aware I've been talking quite a long time. I do have some other comments about the negotiation and how it's going, but we can return to that. So thanks very much, Tracy.
Thanks, Victoria. I guess in light of everything that's been said, one of the questions I had is, what do you see as the key challenges in the negotiation? So perhaps we could turn to that. And perhaps if we start with Helen, obviously there's a lot of challenges and certainly some of them have been alluded to. Geopolitics is probably something we haven't got into, but must, in the particular environment we're in, create a significant challenge. But yeah, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, clearly the geopolitical environment creates extra challenges. it would have been challenging enough without the crisis over Ukraine, but it's even more challenging now. Some major powers like China, like Russia, have been clear that they don't want new instruments which they would see impinging on national sovereignty. Now, the question is then, how do they end up defining that, and what would they accept? Some of the recommendations our panel made about the WHO having right of access with no argy-bargy over visas, that they may see that as an infringement on sovereignty. They may see the capacity of the WHO to publish whatever it knows without permission as a breaching sovereignty. They may see sanctions for non-compliance, almost certainly would, as breaching national sovereignty. So this is all extremely complicated. As I say, then you have the sort of challenge at the other end of it, the US that would like to see all these things, but it is in a position where it doesn't really want to have to go up to Congress and ask for a vote in favour of a new conventional treaty. So perhaps the more technical it is through IHR or whatever, the happier they would be. So I think then we come to the position of developing countries, and there's a lot of anger, and justified anger, at the inequitable global response. The reality is the West looked after itself, and Africa is lagging very badly behind in vaccination rates and access to other essential goods needed to fight a pandemic. So Victoria has stressed the importance of equity as a principle in the treaty. I have absolutely no doubt that Africa and other developing and emerging regions will demand this. But they don't want to be left in a lurch like this again. They may also want some recognition of the emerging regionalism in communicable disease control and management. The African CDC, which was set up by the African Union, has actually done pretty well. So they may want some recognition of these regional mechanisms. So I think geopolitics, the traditional sort of feeling of some states that they don't want anything else that requires them to do things they don't really want to do, they don't want sanctions to be applied. But that means that you may have to go heavier on the carrot approach than the stick. All of this is to be bargained for, but none of it will be straightforward. The 205 IHR will not straightforward. Any changes now won't be, and the new instrument will be very difficult. I've often compared the response to this to the response post-Chernobyl, where even in the Cold War, it was possible at the International Atomic Energy Agency within 5 months to agree on 2 new nuclear safety conventions. And you have to ask, why are we so polarized now that we can't act at that speed of lightning to do some of the pretty obvious things that need to be done? But this is the world we live in, and we have to rely on our diplomats and negotiators, with the calls coming from global civil society, parliamentarians, friendly governments, to try and carry through into a better regime legally, and institutionally, and financially than we have at the moment.
Cool. Al, do you have any challenges to add to that?
I think
really sounding pretty daunting.
Yeah, no, Helen's correct. And I think we have to be honest, we're at a very difficult point of history right now, and we have to be measured on what we can achieve. I think some of the biggest risks we find aren't just geopolitical, but also if we ask too much with the package, I think there's a risk it could fragment, and you may need more than one. You might need to divide it up into parts. I think there's also a risk if you go too heavy on the sticks as well. If people start talking about compliance and about punishment for those who don't adhere or work with what they've got, I think countries may just walk away. I think Helen's independent panel did a 6-month review of the work, and I think it hit an essential point. It was like, why have you done nothing in the time that we had? And the problem is that the longer we get away from the original outburst of the pandemic, the less urgent it becomes. And if we don't act soon and feel the weight of those millions of deaths, we will lose that opportunity to actually achieve anything at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could just come in off the back of that, this has been a concern articulated by many from a relatively early stage in the pandemic, when it looked likely that vaccines would develop. And I recall a conversation with the most senior levels of the IMF where they said their concern was that when the vaccines were rolled out, the West would say, well, done and dusted, we've dealt with it, and leave COVID-19 to become a disease that lingered on in developing countries because of lack of access to the essential commodities to fight it, sort of cementing in the inequity. And let's face it, there's a danger of that, isn't there? That the West has more or less wiped its hands of COVID and said, oh, well, we're vaccinated, we're getting on with life, which is a ridiculous attitude, frankly, when you still have a novel pathogen which has a huge capacity to surprise. But meantime, out there in sub-Saharan Africa, where I doubt whether full vaccination levels have achieved even 10% yet, this is an ongoing concern. And the longer we let it rip, the more risk we are all at of more dangerous and transmissible variants coming. So this is a moment that should be seized, but every moment now is a lost moment, and the Ukraine crisis has come at absolutely the wrong time, because who's talking pandemic now? It's not leading anyone's news, not even ours. While we look at the crushing of Ukraine, which is very depressing. So, yeah, I mean, who knows if or when that will blow over in some tragic way or better way, but we have to get the focus back on making the reforms that have been identified as important and preparing us better for next time a novel pathogen with pandemic potential emerges.
I think one of the things for me looking on is, I guess, as a trade lawyer and not knowing so much about this area and thinking, well, surely if nothing else is going to drive countries, shouldn't it be self-interest? And the fact that you just can't allow this disease to keep circulating anywhere in the world because of the variants that could emerge that could be worse than what we've seen. So it's really difficult, I guess, to understand how that, that it's cynical, but why doesn't that drive countries, to respond?
A very Victoria, good question, and it's been said time and time again, nobody's safe till everybody's safe, and that continues to be true.
And it's Victoria, can we turn to you on the challenges? Hopefully you don't have any more, but I'm sure you do.
I wanted to mention the negotiating challenge of negotiating a multilateral instrument when up until now we haven't even met in person. So the meetings online have been, the meetings so far have been virtual. There is a hope that we will return to in-person negotiations, I think, by the time we have the first substantive set of negotiations in July. Now, there are some advantages about online negotiations. You can do quite effective bilaterals, you can do quite effective small group meetings, but I don't know you can really crunch the issues with everyone there and have the side conversations, the kind of buzz around the room that moves people towards agreement. So I think that's definitely one of the challenges. Now, the others have mentioned the form issues. I'm an optimist on form. I think there are lots of different creative ways to structure things to meet the kind of overwhelming need of those participating. And I think they'll come through eventually if we can only get some kind of coalescing around what is the actual substance that we're trying to agree on. So for me, thinking about some of the options, I mean, Helen's absolutely right. The improvements of the IHRs is an essential ingredient, but then how does that ingredient of the improved IHRs sit alongside a new instrument? And I can think of a range of different approaches here. One is to actually pick the IHRs up and incorporate them in a new agreement. Trade lawyers amongst you may think about the World Trade Organization agreement, which came out of the Doha round in 1995. Now, that agreement actually legally incorporates the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs from 1947. And that's a great way. The WTO's got some great examples of how a system evolved over time incrementally and then was wrapped up in a treaty system. Now, there are things that are not going so well with that at the moment, but they are not to do with the fault of how it was created. Another option would actually be to use the vehicle of the IHRs. One of the brilliant things about the way the IHRs are set up in the World Health Organization Constitution is they have this wonderful thing called tacit acceptance. You don't actually need the majority of the countries to ratify the new IHRs or the amendments in order for them to enter into force. They will enter into force after a certain amount of time for all those countries that don't actively object. Now, that's a relatively rare device in international law these days. It only exists in a few international organizations. So it's worth really, working on what can you do with that. The US is party to the IHRs through their membership of the World Health Organization. Logically, they could be party to a new set of IHRs. So that's where I wonder, could you improve the existing IHRs, take all the provisions that are not covered in the IHRs, work out what's required, and then have a second set of IHRs Mark II that you sit alongside. And then could you somehow bundle those two elements, both of which would be legally binding and would therefore potentially meet the ambitions of the Friends of the Pandemic Treaty, but then kind of wrap them with a sort of umbrella declaration that didn't require separate ratification, but was really kind of high level and gave whatever you would call these new things, maybe the pandemic accords, gave the pandemic accords real kind of status in Earth. So, I mean, that's an option. And then not all treaties have to be ratified by all important players for them to work. The US is one of the most enthusiastic non-parties of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea you could imagine. They are kind of out there speaking for its provisions all the time. They consider the convention to be international customary law, yet for various reasons to do with the US system, they have never been able to ratify. So what really matters is that a treaty shapes norms and guides behavior. So it's not necessarily a failure if everyone doesn't ratify. So they're just some ideas on the form issue. But I think we need to make progress first on the substance before people will be ready to be creative on the form. And then the final challenge I wanted to touch on has already been mentioned by Al, and I think Helen also made comments, and that is around how do you incentivize compliance? How do you kind of organize that? The traditional international law mechanisms of kind of dispute settlement and legal compliance don't necessarily seem to work that well in a modern context. And I think we need to think very broadly about that. How can we make it in countries' interest to implement and comply? And one of the things I've been kind of rolling over in my mind, because as an international lawyer, I think very much in the world of rights and obligations. What if there was a right of assistance for a state that was suffering a FIAC? What if rather than setting out these kind of intrusive rules where you have to agree to having a sort of intervention from the World Health Organization, what if certain situations actually triggered an obligation on the rest of the international community to actually meaningfully assist in ways that that state felt were commensurate with their sovereignty and kind of autonomy? Can you turn it around that way? I'm very conscious that the consequence of the South African authorities who so quickly notified Omicron was they were immediately slammed with travel bans. That they didn't last long, but it didn't seem like a very good response. So how can we turn around the kind of language of rights and obligations and create approaches where countries genuinely want to implement and comply. And then my last point goes to Helen's comment that not everything has to be in the treaty. Now, I think that's absolutely the case, but it would be good if the treaty is able to kind of connect and talk to things that are outside of the treaty. So there's a lot of talk going on about establishing a financial intermediary fund that would be a long-term fund to provide resources and financing for pandemic-related things. I'd like to think, how can we make a new instrument, a new treaty, connect with that fund? I mean, if you had a compliance panel or they're calling it a universal periodic health review type process where countries were reviewed on how compliant they were with their preparedness obligation, does that give you then a right to go to the fund that's being set up and say, I've got this report, this is what I need, now provide the funding and assistance? So I think we need to think really creatively about what makes states do things and then try and create a system that provides those incentives. Thanks very much, Tracy.
Well, we're starting to get a number of questions in, and we've got about 35 minutes left to run. So I think if the panelists are happy, it'll be great if we could start turning to some of the questions from the audience that I have here. So there's quite a number of them ranging across different topics. I think maybe just for some people, we may have sort of covered this to some degree, but just to clarify, because we have a question here from Duncan Curry, just about whether or not there's a draft treaty. And I think we don't have a draft yet. But she's just wondering about the proposed scope. So I guess I wondered if maybe Victoria, you could just clarify for us, is there actually something on the table yet that have countries agreed to any degree on what the proposed scope might look like? Or is this all still very initial stages?
No, there is not a draft. And what we are expecting is that after the resumed first session, which took place last week and is resuming in 2 weeks' time and is largely in a kind of organisational modalities session, the Bureau, made up of the 2 co-chairs, we've got a co-chair from South Africa and one from the Netherlands, and then 4 others representing the regions. The Bureau will be empowered to develop first the elements to be in the new instrument, and then a draft text, and they'll be instructed to do that in an inclusive and open manner. So big challenge. There will be a number of interactive sessions, I think, with states, but also, just as importantly, sessions with civil society actors to try and work out what those elements would be. And the challenge is to then have a text in time for July. So there's going to be a big kind of flurry of activity. And the thing that I'm trying to think about at the moment is, and picking up partly from a suggestion the US made last week, is could we at least agree on the categories of the things that are going to be in the new instrument? And I'm thinking, if you were going to no instrument can really handle more than about 5 or 6 different categories. What are those buckets of things that we would most want to see, and how do you naturally group them? So I hope that answers the question, Duncan.
Thanks. So that's certainly, helps to clarify for me as well. That's really helpful. Actually, we had an anonymous question here, which I'd be interested in anyone's views on, about the role for non-state actors in negotiation of the treaty. So you just mentioned civil society, Victoria, but to what extent, is there a role for civil society, for corporate interests and other, I guess, scientific interests, researchers and so on in the negotiation process?
Given that I'm the government representative here, I think we should hear from the 2 non-government members of the panel who may have more interesting and valid views than I would, but I'm happy to say something afterwards.
There are incredibly well-informed actors out there on the global health architecture, legal framework, and I think it is important that they are heard. No doubt they're all observing the negotiations and all the reform processes that are underway and being discussed at the WHA and elsewhere. But there is a depth of expertise in civil society, and I'm using civil society very broadly to say it is our scientists, our academics and researchers, our non-governmental organisations, are public health advocates. So to the extent possible, one hopes that there will be a space for them to be, alongside and injecting ideas into the negotiating process. I'm always mindful that whenever I went to a climate change conference of parties, the size of the civil society delegations, they're probably far outnumbered the government negotiators. And someone once described it to me as like Woodstock meets WTO was the atmosphere at the COPs. But just listen to civil society, because there will be expertise and ideas and advocacy coming from there, which will be highly relevant.
If I may, Tracy, I'd just like to add something, and that is when we actually look at what happened with the pandemic and the state's responsibilities, most of the changes and the information that made things occur came from individual scientists, not states. Li Wenliang in China, Marjorie Pollock in Canada, Edward Holmes in Australia, Professor Zhong Ying in Shanghai. And so what you actually found was that the states had the obligations, but it was individual scientists speaking out, often at their own risk, who triggered the responses of, in this instance, Taiwan questioning WHO, that made China respond. And so not just with regard to the negotiations, but also going forward, we have to make sure that the voices of the scientists are protected so that they can feel free to speak out when they see something to be of concern.
Is there a way that you think that the treaty can deal with that?
The treaty talks at the moment about other sources of information, but it doesn't underline the importance of protecting these sources of information so that people aren't put at risk for speaking out. Because if these people had not spoken out when they did, it would have taken even longer to bring to the international attention.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
If I could comment, I think there's some great information there about how much civil society broadly can contribute to not only just the negotiation of a new instrument, but also how important, what an important role particularly the scientific community has actually in responding to pandemics. My impression is that the World Health Organization process is very much aware of this and will be providing suitable avenues for civil society input. But of course, the other way for non-government participants to input is through the input that their delegations take into the negotiations. So I guess this is a moment for a bit of an advertorial, really. We are going to, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Ministry of Health, have to find ways to engage with civil society in New Zealand to help shape and form up the positions that we take into the negotiations. That some have already kind of reached out and been engaging in conversation, but anyone listening to this webinar who wants to find ways both informally and more formally to engage in the New Zealand positions as they evolve should reach out to the organisers of this panel. Because there are some really important perspectives I think we can take into the negotiations. Some of them I might already be aware of, but there'll be lots that I'm not, because health is a new field for us at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, not one that we were deeply involved in. And we are very keen to get that richness of experience to underline the New Zealand position.
Thanks. We have a question here from John Hopkins. And he says the IFRC has recognised in its recent global report on pandemic response the problem that exists between the siloisation of international health law and international disaster risk reduction, which was an issue throughout the pandemic, as many of the responses required went far beyond health. And he notes that the Bangkok principles attempt to link these regimes and wonders whether they've been considered in discussing a possible treaty. So I guess or perhaps we could broaden that to, should they be considered as well?
Well, look, one of the big issues is that the response that's required goes far beyond what the health sector can do. And in all truth, WHO would like to grab this and control it, but there's a lot of other international organisations with a direct interest. I mean, just take, for example, the way ACT-A COVAX has been working as the not particularly adequate platform for supply of commodities. It's had the Global Fund, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, CEPI, the World Economic Forum initiated body. You know, there's a lot of actors out there, so it can't all be dealt with just on a convention that empowers WHO one way or another. I rather liked the way Victoria pitched it as, I might be oversimplifying it, but cross-referencing to other relevant actors and instruments. I like the idea of pandemic accords, but we shouldn't go into these negotiations thinking that this can all be resolved through the silo of health, because it can't. The role of the IMF, the World Bank, the range of development and humanitarian organisations is relevant. The Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, which member states agreed to in 2015, is relevant and actually is quite prophetic in providing, around what needs to be done for pandemic preparedness. So we need, I think, perhaps as New Zealand, to be promoting that broader canvas that needs to be painted on, and most definitely animal and human health are closely linked. I mean, in the end, this can become everything. There's a rather interesting movement called something like Pandemic Prevention at Source, which is looking at the conservation of forests and natural habitats and not encroaching on them, and stopping wildlife trafficking, and decreasing the potential for zoonotic spillover. It can become everything, which of course isn't practical for negotiation, but at least being aware of this broader context and the range of actors and sectors which have to play like an orchestra to get the good response, I think is important.
Actually, I think that point you just made there, Helen, that it can't be everything, that goes to another question that Ruby Aya has asked. No, sorry, it wasn't Ruby, it was someone else, Murray and Lisa, wondering what strategies can be adopted to stop a new treaty from becoming a sort of Christmas tree that's so wide in scope and context and content that it just becomes impossible to agree. So I wonder if any of the panelists would like to respond to that question, because it could be so broad.
Could be so broad as to be meaningless, which is why I kind of stand on saying what really needs to be fixed here, and what's the most likely way we'll be able to fix it, rather than trying to throw in governance, finance, the new ACT-A COVAX platform, everything but the kitchen sink. The reality is that the US, for one, will not go along with the WHO controlling a financing mechanism. They are very intent on the financial intermediary fund that they have been designing, with a lot of help from one of Norway's most talented global health diplomats. They want that hosted in the World Bank. Well, that's as good a place as anywhere, frankly, but they won't have it in WHO. That's why I say there's a range of organisations and institutions involved here. And we need to really work out what these processes at WHO can cover and what they can't.
Victoria? Yeah.
I can have a go on that. I think it is really important to avoid things blowing out. And I guess a country like New Zealand can try and encourage others to be really disciplined. One of the challenges, there are some themes already in the negotiation, like the theme of equity. And Helen pointed to some of the genuine anger that's coming from certain parts of the world. But we need to really focus the discussions on what would equity look like? What are the actual provisions, and how would you do things differently in a way that would be more equitable? Because just as a principle, it's a useful kind of guide, I suppose, to state behaviour. But unless we actually embed into the instrument some new processes that would lead to equity, it's not going to make a difference. And then the other thought I had on siloization and avoiding kind of the whole Christmas tree approach is it is possible for an overarching new instrument to refer to things that then exist outside of the instrument. I mean, we all come from what we're used to. I think of a free trade agreement. A free trade agreement has a number of annexes, not all of which are legally binding. And some of those can be kind of living instruments that are evolved, you know, operational processes. So, for example, I understand that the PIP, and I can't remember what it stands for, but it was the PIP is the process that's was used to share pathogens in the influenza context. I understand that's quite a good model. You know, you could imagine a new instrument that has some high-level principles, but also sort of sets some tasks that then exist connected to the new instrument, but at the more sort of organic level. So that would be my suggestions. And to the person who asked about whether we were drawing from the emergency and sort of disaster response field, some maybe. It's not an area I'm particularly familiar with. So I will have a look at those principles that you referred to.
I'll just add, I think it will be increasingly important for people to actually prioritise what they want to achieve out of the negotiations, because otherwise it could be a wasted effort. But for me, the main thing is just to, as much as possible, is to separate the science from the politics, to make sure that the institutions get the material that they need. And even within these areas, you can still have equity. So absolutely a One Health approach. And with developing countries, that means making more money available for science for them so that they can do what's needed. So each area, you have to have equity in it. I don't think it's one topic which has to be dealt with exclusively by itself.
On the subject of equity, we've had a couple of questions about equitable vaccine access. Ed Wright asks whether there's been discussion about creating an improved framework for equitable vaccine access. Is that something that sort of should remain separate from this process, or is this part of the process? How does that fit in?
Well, that's certainly a key recommendation of the independent panel, which I co-chaired. As I say, whether it can be part of the Christmas tree of the conventional treaty is another matter. But I think, and Victoria will be up with this, I think that the range of recommendations that the range of review bodies have made, all these recommendations have been allocated to different WHA working group processes. So someone somewhere is looking at these things. Now, what our panel said about the inequitable access is that the model that was designed on the fly, this Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, of which COVAX, the vaccine funding and distribution mechanism, is part, it's a flawed model. It's based on a market model, paying the market price, and with it funded charitably. And this is just not good enough when you're talking about global public goods in the context of a pandemic. So we recommended that there be a redesign based on a sort of end-to-end concept where you would envisage cooperation and pooled funding according to a formula for research and development through to where and how produced and to allocation and distribution. So I'm currently with a couple of our other panels working on getting support for funding to get a very precise study done on this to flesh out the ideas a bit better. But basically, we think it needs a sort of global public investment approach relevant to the supply of global public goods and to move away from the sort of market and charity whip around model that exists at the moment. So, I mean, there's a lot more, of course, one could say about all that, but what we have doesn't work. And, you know, we're in the situation where countries like ours can, you know, get 95% vaccinated, while Sierra Leone's probably still struggling to, you know, clear 8 to 10.
Yeah. Al, Victoria, would you like to weigh in on that? Or?
I agree entirely with Alan. The only thing I would add is, if you were ever going to break up the Christmas tree, this is something I think could almost be a standalone convention, but for the importance of equity around this type of issue. And the difficulty here I see not so much as one that's involved with health law, but trade law. And that's where I will now pass the ball to Victoria.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about the trade law aspects, and I'm aware there are separate discussions going on under the auspices of the World Trade Organization around the TRIPS waiver. And I don't know whether those discussions are going to lead to a useful outcome or not. I know when I talk to my colleagues in the ministry who have been working on the vaccine issues in a more sort of tangible way, you know, working on how did we source our own vaccines, how have we contributed to COVAX, how have we assisted vaccines to be delivered into the Pacific. I know their view is not that they don't see that the intellectual property protections was actually the problem that is stopping vaccines getting in arms. I mean, we have plenty of vaccines at the moment. The issues seem to be much more kind of complicated than that. So I don't have an answer on that. They're doing some thinking in the ministry on what a new instrument could or could not contribute on the vaccine equity issue. We see it as a core area, and one we'll be talking to other countries about a lot. But I don't really have anything to say at the moment on that. But I would say that having a better system for the rapid development and equitable access of medical countermeasures is one of the things we'll be prioritizing in the discussions, just not kind of really at the stage of trying to work out what the solutions would look like yet.
A couple of thoughts on this, because Victoria earlier mentioned the sort of concept of a framework convention being overarching, and we've talked a couple of times about protocols. The framework convention could be quite broad, but as Alex said, negotiate specific protocols for different areas under it, and that could happen in the fullness of time. I mean, one of those protocols could be early notification, as Alex and others have suggested. Another one could be a protocol about the design of a global public goods platform. I think those are useful ideas to think about. On the supply of essential goods during a pandemic, of course, it's not just vaccines, it's also therapeutics. 3 parts of none of that's got out to most developing countries. The most up-to-date diagnostics, even oxygen and personal protective equipment was in very, very short supply. So the platform needs to be quite broad. Now, Victoria is right that a TRIPS waiver is not an instant answer at all. It's all very well to say we waive intellectual property rights, but Moderna and Pfizer have got their knowledge and technology locked up under lock and key and aren't sharing it. And even these reports you see now about WHO announcing various mRNA hubs in different countries, my understanding is there's no handing over of the knowledge and technology. That basically the deal is that the company concerned will go and make it there. So this is a problem. Our panel, I thought, was quite pragmatic on this. We said that the fastest way to get increased production around the world's region would be for a bit of carrot and stick to provide to the major companies to get voluntary licensing of the goods required, and to have the vaccine producing countries putting pressure on the companies to come to the party to share the knowledge and technology to do that. There was a major beat missed very early on in the pandemic when Europe, UK, US, Japan, etc. poured megabucks into the development of vaccines, but never put any criteria on that said this has to be a global public good. So the companies have had their record share prices out of the high demand for these, but it hasn't been satisfactory for most of the world's peoples. But I do think myself, as a matter of principle, that and maybe not now, but when WTO ever gets to meet and discuss these things, it abandoned its meeting ministerial meeting last November because of the ban on travel from South Africa, and there was South Africa with India leading the charge on the TRIPS waiver, so it really wasn't practical to continue. But I believe that in the event of a pandemic, and here's another issue, no global definition in law of a pandemic. We simply have the public health emergency of international concern. Tedros used the term pandemic eventually to wake people up, but it has no legal basis. But could we have a threshold whereby a TRIPS waiver becomes automatic at a certain threshold? You know, we would never have got to the much more effective containment and reduction of HIV around the world if it hadn't been for the intellectual property being waived on the production of the drugs. And it seems to me that we need some provision in international trade law that says when we're really up against it, there should be an automatic waiver. I'm not suggesting a waiver for anything and everything, but I think there are circumstances where we shouldn't 2 years later be arguing about whether we need to share knowledge and technology. We should have tools which enable us to do it in our common and shared interest. Someone raised the point, why don't we all get it? But it's in everybody's interest to get this under control and fast.
I'd like to sort of turn to another question on a slightly related, it's obviously all related but different topic. And we've had a couple of questions about Indigenous communities. One question from Valmeen Toki saying that Indigenous communities already experience poor access to healthcare, and some communities are seeking their own solution to this problem. How would a treaty assist? And similarly, an anonymous a question about how would a treaty help Māori? So I wonder if I could ask who would like to respond to those questions.
Look, it's been a pandemic of inequalities, and it's exacerbated every known fracture in inequality in societies. And we've seen the debate in our own country where Māori feel that basically they didn't have timely access, and you know, there's a whole lot of issues there, but clearly there's the basis of a grievance, to say the least. It may be that with the coming of the Māori Health Authority, it can be a much more assertive voice for appropriate responses, because 101 public health is that one size doesn't fit all. You must meet people where they are in their own context. This applies not only in how public health measures relate to and connect with Māoridom, it relates to many other constituencies as well. I mean, one of the things that got the pandemic away in our country was the ignoring of the specific needs of people who use drugs, particularly methamphetamine. And when the pandemic got into those networks, you know, it's the old story, like the post, the drug supply will always get through. But if you're trying to be a contact tracer, and you know, I'm ringing from the government to see if, you can imagine what people who are consuming an illicit good are going to do, get under the bed and certainly take the phone off the hook. So we never applied basic lessons of public health at an early enough stage to reach those communities. So there's so many lessons coming out of this, but I think that the Māori voice on it should be vocal here about the need to be included in the design of the response from day one to ensure that the measures can reach communities in a culturally appropriate way. And same applies for Pacifica and for other communities.
I just thought I'd add there that I think Helen's touched on some very kind of logical and cogent contributions that a Maori perspective would bring to the treaty, and I'm really interested to engage further on that and hear from people in this webinar and elsewhere on what they would like to see reflected in the discussions in the intergovernmental body coming from that perspective. So I think it's a really important area.
Unfortunately, I'm starting to become aware of time, that we are starting to run out of time. So if I could, and I apologise to everyone whose questions I'm unable to ask, but if I could just ask one question quite quickly from Joanna Mossop at Victoria University, who talks about, as the scope of the pandemic was becoming clear, many countries closed their borders to cruise ships. And she says, because of the high use of flags of convenience and open registries, some of those vessels were stuck with passengers and crew on board who were left without a right to enter ports. And I think the same thing has happened with container ships and so on. So she asked whether this is an issue that might be addressed by a treaty. For example, could we require all states to have a port that is equipped to deal with health emergencies and can receive ill people?
If I could just quickly respond, it seems to me that there are a number of vulnerable populations that we have identified through the experience of the pandemic. We've just been talking about Indigenous communities being vulnerable. I think seafarers are extremely vulnerable. The issue that Joanna points to is a very valid one. So I would hope so. There were rules already in place, but when you have very strict border measures, I'm not sure they necessarily worked for seafarers. So it's an important point to take on board.
I'll just add, I think so much about what has to happen now is we have to evolve in all international organizations, because we just weren't prepared for what happened, and everywhere we were caught out. We didn't think it would get this bad. We didn't think it would go this long, but now it's a chance to reflect and actually build going forwards.
Absolutely. I have perhaps what I'd like to do at this point is go around each of our panelists and ask you to respond to 2 questions to close out our session. So I guess one question is, I guess sort of if we can just try to sum all this up, really, we've talked about so many different possibilities and challenges, but if there are, 3 priorities for you that you would like to see be achieved, within the next 2 years of the time frame that the World Health Organization has laid out, what would those priorities be? And secondly, this is a question from Stacey Fraser, asking, what is your sense of the international community's political will to actually establishing a treaty or something similar? So yeah, your priorities and your sense of the political will. Perhaps if we, shall we start perhaps with Victoria and then go to Al and give Helen the last word, if that suits.
That'd be great. I'll go quite granular because I'm sure there will be bigger picture sort of visions coming from the other 2. There are so many things I would like to see in the treaty. I find it really hard to kind of narrow it down to 3. But the 3 biggies for me would be rules to help maintain global supply chains for medical countermeasures. There were bans, export bans put in place that were not helpful. I would like the treaty to include a pre-negotiated system for rapid development and equitable access of medical countermeasures. And then I would like the treaty to have embedded in it some really clever mechanisms to encourage implementation and compliance. And set a new kind of departure in how treaties can do that. I think there's a need for some real creativity there. And then your other question was, do we think there's enough momentum? Is there enough will? I think there's a lot of will, but I think we will need assistance from, we can only do so much as negotiators at the working level. We're going to need assistance from leaders, and we're going to need assistance from others with kind of global profile and presence to nudge things along at the right time.
My wish list of 3 things. First of all, the One Health approach. I think that's critical. The second one I would go for is the importance of precaution being built into the new instrument. And the third one is transparency, so that we can get as much information out there as possible. To answer your question, what do I think? I think it's a glass half full. I think there's possibly some good chances out there, but there's going to be a lot of challenges as well.
Well, my three would be, I'd want to see it crystal clear how member states should act when a pandemic threat emerges. I would want to see whether it's IHR or convention, WHO, given the powers to act effectively and be the global health leader in this when a pandemic threat arises. And thirdly, I think this area around carrots and incentives for compliance will be very, very important. I think something will come out of all the reviews and reforms and discussions. The question is how far along the spectrum towards being optimal it can be, rather than lowest common denominator. Our panel continues to advocate and work with diplomats in New York around the UN General Assembly, negotiating a political declaration to support the whole reform momentum, or to help create more momentum, and to move towards a high-level event engaging the attention of heads of state and government. So that again can be helpful for weighing in on, let's get the job done. So I remain optimistic that some things will happen. Whether they're adequate and big enough is the issue.
Cool. Well, we are unfortunately at 7 o'clock. So I just want to thank our three wonderful panelists so much for making your time available. It's been just an incredibly interesting and fruitful discussion, I think, and thank you so much to all our participants. And just a final little advertisement, I guess, for the Beeby colloquium, or Beeby exchange, as we're now calling it. We're hoping to hold it in person in Wellington in November, so you'll hopefully receive invitations later. But in the meantime, to try to get some engagement during the year, we're going to be hosting what we're calling Beeby local events. So we're in the process of setting up smaller events at universities in Auckland, Waikato, Victoria, Canterbury, so that international lawyers can hopefully get together in a smaller environment where it's a little bit easier to hold in-person events, and hopefully still have some of that, this really incredibly helpful engagement. So please do keep an eye out for emails where we'll advise you of those events coming up. I think we're looking at Canterbury in September, Waikato in May, and we'll certainly be letting you know. So thank you again, everyone, and good luck to Victoria for the hard work ahead. Thank you.